let's say Friday, you know, we'll start out with the quiz, you know, like we normally do, you know, the 10-minute deal. And most of the questions, you know, there'll only be about 10 questions. Most of the questions will be relative to imaging systems, but I'll probably have a, you know, question relative to image data, and you know, a question concerning processing. Okay. All right. It is warm in here, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
that feels great. I like it.
Yeah. Okay. So you all ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so image processing. Let's see this works. Okay. You know what this is up here?
Vending machine.
It doesn't.
It's like a cigarette, old cigarette.
Yeah, I had that. Those are two new ones on that. Okay. Vending machine and the cigarette machine. Okay.
Maybe a soda dispenser.
Maybe a soda dispenser. Oh gosh, yeah, and I had forgotten about the old cigarette vending machines, and I can't remember what movie we were watching. Just happened to be like last weekend, and it had in that movie, you could see in the background, old cigarette vending machine. Yeah, you put your change in, and this little knob that you would
Yeah.
pull, and Do y'all know what we're talking about?
There's one downtown still.
Is it
I
really?
don't think it has cigarettes in it. I think it has like packs of playing cards in it. But it's
Oh, okay,
a machine.
okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's a cigarette machine, vending machine. It's a processor, okay? But as far as what type of processor it is, that's what we used with film processing. So inside of this device, we had the chemicals. And I believe I showed you all, didn't I, back in the summer, our processor that we have in the dark room. I took the lid off. Did I show you what that looked like?
I don't remember that.
Okay, I couldn't remember if we did it or not. Sometimes I'll do it when we do an intro to the equipment. Other times I'll wait until we get to image processing, and then I'll just show you. So tomorrow in lab, I'll take just a minute or two, and I'll take the lid off of our processor just so you could see what the chemistry tanks look like and the roller assembly that would move the film through the chemicals. But there were two main chemicals. There was a developer that would start the processing of the image, and then there was another chemistry tank called Fixer, and the Fixer would basically harden the image. Because believe it or not, film actually consists of gelatin. Just like, you know, Jell-O, it's gelatin, so when it goes into this developer solution, it swells and gets real mushy, and it's so the chemistry can get in there to process the image. And then the next tank it goes into with a Fixer, it will shrink that gelatin base back, and then it goes through wash water, and then it goes through a dryer, and then the film would come out here. So this type of processor would be located on the outside of the darkroom. So you go into the darkroom, and there would be on the back side of this, there would be a tray that would come in through the wall, and so you take your film out, put it on that tray, and it would run it through here, and then your film would drop out there on the outside of the darkroom. This is a type of digital processor, and I've had that in a PowerPoint or two. And with this one, this is for PSP cassettes, and you just line them up on here, and then it takes them and will flip them and insert them into this device here, turns them around, extracts the plate. So it's similar to our reader device, it's just a different vendor for this one, that's Carestream. So processing, you know, we've come a long ways from chemicals to digital, okay? And back before these automatic processors, films had to be hand dipped into the chemistry. And then in the darkroom, the films had to be hung up on a clothesline with clothespins for the films to dry. So it's come a long way. So with digital processing, it's all software driven. So it's all computers. It's all software driven, no chemicals whatsoever. So, you know, that's kind of nice because the chemistry was kind of a pain to deal with, and sometimes those fumes could be a little overwhelming with those dark room fumes. So it's all software driven because it's all algorithms, it's mathematical formulas. That's what algorithms are, it's all mathematics. Because, you know, digital image, remember, what is a digital image made of? What makes up a digital image? Pixels, and inside those pixels, based upon, you know, the signal intensity, what is assigned to the pixel?
The number,
Number, yeah, a number. So numbers are assigned to the individual pixels. Well, what can be done with numbers? You can manipulate, you can put numbers into math formulas and manipulate that data. So it's all processing algorithms, math formulas. So yes, we can manipulate that data. Okay, the computer can manipulate it with processing, and then there are even things that we can do after the image displays, you know, to change that data set. So with processing, one of the things you need to be familiar with is something that's referred to as initial image processing. How many of you have noticed, because we've been down in the lab long enough now, that when we process our image and the image first starts to come up on the workstation, it just really looks gray. You know, it just kind of just a flat image. It's just gray, you know, not pleasing to look at. Essentially, that's what we call the raw image data. The raw image data, and it's just a low contrast image. But then all of a sudden, you know, there's a little flash, and then the actual image appears, and that's what we call the forward presentation image. That's when all the processing algorithms have been applied to it. So with initial image processing, what the system is doing is it's altering, it's manipulating and making changes to that raw data. It's making changes to the raw data. So when that gray image initially appears, that's the raw image data set. It doesn't have any really any processing applied to that yet. And then when you see that image pop up, that's after that initial image processing has taken place. You know, whatever algorithms have been applied to that image to give it that appearance when it comes up on the screen. So the initial image processing, essentially, you know, that's the beginning. That's what we, you know, end up with on that monitor. Okay, so that's the beginning. Then we have post-image processing. Post-image processing. Okay, so this is processing that we can do, you know, at the end or after the fact. You know, after that initial image comes up, then, you know, we can manipulate that data. You know, we can go back into the software, into those functions, and we can apply changes to the data. And so you'll hear that referred to as post-processing, you know, manipulating that data. Did you see any changes between these two slides? Pardon?
a different person.
A different person. That's the initial image that came up. And I have no idea who this is. I'm not sure who that is. I know that's Lincoln. I don't know who this is. Okay. But yeah, the image was post-processed and it was changed. Okay, the image was changed. Well, the reason I have optimal settings down here and a question mark is because as a technologist, if you're finding that you're always having to manipulate an image, you know, maybe when you take knee images, you're always having to manipulate that data set. You're always having to kind of reprocess that image or post-process and make changes to it. Then you know, that's really not good, because that takes, you know, that takes time. So if that's, you know, if that's the case, then maybe, the supervisor should be asked if, hey, can we change the settings, because these settings, they're not optimal. You know, we're always having to manipulate these knee images, because if we send the image the way it is, you know, the radiologist really doesn't care for it. You know, we're having to change it. So, you know, you may need to question the supervisor and say, can we get a super user in here to go into the system and make corrections so that the image will appear the way we know the radiologist wants that image to appear. And, you know, one thing, and I think you've probably already experienced this, is images will have different appearances at different institutions, from different rooms. You know, the images, they appear differently. You know, even if you were to use the same set of exposure factors and the same size patient, how many of you have noticed that? There are differences in how the images look. And you know, a lot of that's due to the processing algorithms. And, you know, the vendor's settings. And that doesn't mean that you can't change those, or, you know, or that a super user can't change those in consultation with the radiologist, because the last thing you want someone to do is to go into the system and make changes to it. The radiologist isn't happy with that. Of course, you know, radiologists can manipulate images too, but you want the image to be sent to them the way they want it when it first appears on their screen, and then they can manipulate it from there. So, you know, also too, in terms of optimal settings, there's no universal setting for how images should appear. You know, it will vary from vendor to vendor, and it'll vary from radiologist to radiologist, and what their preferences are and how they want these images to look. Okay. So you understand initial processing and post-processing. Initial basically is what we end up seeing on that workstation when it comes up, and then post-processing is if we manipulate that image. Okay. Now, there are some post-processing pitfalls, ethical concerns, and legalities. Okay. Ethical concerns as well as legalities. Okay. Tomorrow in lab, we'll do an experiment dealing with image processing. And so we'll do some things as far as post-processing. And then I'll save the images and put them on the workstation, and we'll look at those images, and we'll talk about this, okay? So for right now, just keep this in mind, that, hey, with post-processing, there may be some reasons why we want to be careful in manipulating the data, okay? So we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow when we walk through some of the images that we end up taking, okay? So just beware of that. All right. As far as terminology is concerned, some of these things you already know. Sampling, quantitization, we'll talk about histogram analysis here. But sampling, just as a reminder, sampling means that the system is doing what to the data? What is sampling? Remember, electrons are released from the image detectors. That's analog data. So what is sampling?
It's like just interpreting it, or is it converting it to?
Converting it, right? Sampling is, it's selecting data points from that analog wave. And when it does that, what is created? Because remember, electrons, that's an electronic signal. That's a sinusoidal wave. That's analog. The computer cannot do anything with that. So that analog to digital converter will take data points from that analog signal and convert it into, to what?
Digital.
Into digital, so it's converting it into the, what's that little square box? The pixel, right? So it's converting it into that digital format, which is a pixel. And then the other thing the analog to digital converter does is what? What is this? Quantization. Takes the pixel and does what to it?
Assigns it a value.
Assigns it a value. I mean, think term quantity, you know, so it's assigning a value, right? And that value, you know, it is based upon the bit depth, because the value that gets assigned to each pixel can't exceed the number of values that the computer can assign it. But then too, it's also based upon, you know, the intensity of the signal that's been received, that signal intensity, you know, how the x-rays interact inside the patient's body, that plays a role, you know, in the number that gets assigned to the particular pixel. Okay? Histogram, we'll talk about a histogram. Okay, histogram is a plot of data, so we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about histogram analysis, and histogram analysis plays a role in something that's called VOI, or values of interest, and we'll get to it. Plays a role in automatic rescaling and lookup table. Okay. So, you already know sampling and quantization. So we'll pick up here with histogram, okay? So, a histogram, what it is it's just a graph, it's a plot. And it is a plot of all of the pixel values. And again, that's why, you know, I briefly went over quantization, because quantization is where the analog to digital converter assigns numerical values to every single pixel in that data set, okay? So then what happens is, after all of the pixels have been assigned a numerical value, the system creates a plot of that data. And so it plots the values of every single pixel. So, you know, we have pixels that'll have a value of 0. We'll have pixels that'll have a value of whatever the bit depth is. Like if you only have an 8-bit system, then the max value would be 255. So it assigns a max value. You know, 10-bit system, then you're talking about the max value a pixel can have would be 1024. So it takes all of the image data and it plots it into a histogram. And it plots the value of each individual pixel against the frequency or the number of pixels that have that value. So, you know, how many pixels have a value of 0? How many pixels have a value of 1? How many pixels have a value of 2, 3, 4, all the way up to the bit depth. And then basically if you were to connect all the dots, you know, you end up with a curve that kind of looks something like that. So it's nothing more than plotting how many pixels have these different values. That's all it is. It's just a graph. Does that make sense to you? That's just a graph. If I give you a grid with rows and columns of numbers, you can make a histogram. You know, it's just simply counting how many zeros do I have, how many ones, how many twos, how many threes, and then you connect the dots, and this is what you end up with. Okay. The reason I have this little color chart down here is just as a reminder that with digital imaging, with medical imaging, when you have values that are closer to 0 towards the lower end of the spectrum, that corresponds to pixels that will show up with increased brightness. They show up whiter, increased brightness. When you have pixel values that get higher and closer to, you know, the maximum number that can be assigned, we have decreased brightness. So those pixels will be black. So if you have a 10-bit system and you've got pixels that have a value of 1023, those pixels will be black. And then of course, you know, everything in between here. Okay? Everything in between here. So that's a histogram. Histogram is just a plot of the pixel values and the number of those values in that image data set. So you okay with that for right now? Okay. Then what the system does is it does something that's called histogram analysis. Histogram analysis. So what the system does is it will compare your image data to models in the system. So whenever you make an exposure, you've got all those digital values in your image matrix, and it makes a histogram of that data. The system will look at your histogram and it will compare it to histogram models that are in the system. So it's going to make comparisons of your histogram to the model histograms that are in the system. Because the model histograms represent how that image should appear. So it's going to compare your data set to how it should appear. Okay? So, like comparing apples to oranges. So, it's going to see how close, does your data set look like an apple and it should look like an orange? So then the system knows it has to do more adjustments to it. Okay? And what it'll do with that histogram is it will compare the peaks, the troughs, and the width of the histogram, of your histogram, to the model histogram. So it looks at the peaks, the high points, it looks at the troughs, the low points, and it looks at the width of that histogram. Okay? And it'll use that information to know how does this need to be adjusted to present this image in an acceptable manner.
Is the width the bit depth?
Pardon?
Is the width the bit depth?
The width cannot exceed the bit depth. The width cannot exceed the bit depth. But depending on your exposure, you may have values that maybe you use way too much exposure and you have a really narrow histogram because all your values are kind of high. But yeah, that width cannot exceed the bit depth, exactly. Because if you don't have that color crayon in the box, you can't have that color assigned to anything. So, the maximum number that can be assigned is based upon the bit depth. So yes, it won't exceed that. So as part of the histogram analysis, when it looks at the shape, the width and the peaks and the trough, it determines the VOI, the values of interest, meaning what values are we going to include in processing. Now that doesn't mean that other data won't necessarily show up. Other data can appear on the image, but it has to look at what are the values of interest that we need to run through the processing algorithms to make adjustments to. So it looks at the values of interest. What do we want to include in this data set? Okay, in this data set. And so it looks at the models that are in the system and looks at your data and tries to determine, okay, where are we going to put our points of inclusion for these values of interest? So just as an example, chest image. And this is the histogram that was created. Again, really this could be a little rounder, a little smoother. Sometimes it's hard to get smooth points, when we do these graphs. So values of interest. So with this particular example, the system included from this trough down to the very end here as in its values of interest. So all of the pixel values from here to here were included in a processing algorithm to make adjustments to the data to present it appropriately. This block of data here, it does appear on the image, but it wasn't included in the values of interest because it didn't need to make adjustments to it. Okay, so we'll go through the scene, see what I'm talking about. All right, so, another thing to point out to you, when you look at these graphs, these histograms, the closer you are down to this end, to the right end, that means X-rays have either been transmitted. It can also correspond to raw radiation. So the further down this end you are, the values correspond to transmission or raw radiation. And so they're going to show up, you know, black, dark areas of luminance, decreased luminance. As you move this direction on the histogram, these numerical values correspond to increased levels of absorption. So, you know, numbers closer to zero signify more absorption, and that's why it shows up with increased brightness. Okay, so let's start here at this end with this spike here. Okay, this blob of data here. That actually corresponds to all of this raw radiation. You know, I only have the arrow drawn up here because it would get too cluttered, but this and this, even some here and up here. So that's raw radiation. Okay, what's meant by raw radiation? We've mentioned it a while ago. You remember what raw radiation is?
It didn't pass through anything before it reached the IR.
Mm-hmm. It didn't pass through anything before it reached the IR. So, you know, when you do a chest image, you're bound to end up with raw radiation above the shoulders and on the sides. That's raw radiation. Okay? So if you notice, that is going to have the highest numerical value associated with it, because that was a strong intensity, strong signal that was generated by the detector from that raw radiation, because it didn't interact with anything. Right? It's a lot of X-ray, just making it right to the image detector, right to the image detector. Okay. Now, let's see. This peak here. So see, then we have a trough. Anytime there's a trough, that represents a transition point. That you're changing, like the atomic number and mass density. You're changing the attenuation characteristics. So we've got this trough, and all of a sudden we have this big blob here of data. That corresponds to the lungs. So we have a lot of frequency. Remember, this is frequency here. So we have a lot of frequencies within this upper range here, because when you look at the chest, those lungs make up a significant portion of that image. That's why that blob is so big. We have a lot of frequencies, a lot of pixels that have these numerical values. And again, since we're at this end of the spectrum, this end of the histogram, that corresponds to structures that very readily transmitted photons. And so these higher numbers show up as decreased brightness. Then there's a trough signifying, okay, we've got a change in attenuation here, and we've got this blob here. And that corresponds to like the mediastinal area. So more absorption. So the numbers are lower. That corresponds to increased brightness. Then there's a trough, and then this little blip right here of data. Very low numbers, meaning a lot of absorption, but we don't have, you know, high frequency of it, so it must mean, yeah, this has got to be a small structure because we don't have a lot of these. So what does that correspond to? That metal, the pacemaker. So whenever you make an X-ray exposure, it's creating a histogram, okay? It's creating a histogram. And it will look at models in the system and compare your model to decide where should I drop these values of interest. And it, you know, looks at the peaks and the valleys and decides where to drop those values that need to be included in processing. So now you notice this, this spike here was not included in the processing per se. It didn't need to be run through processing algorithms, okay? These values of interest were so that adjustments could be made to create this image here to make it, you know, exactly appropriate the way we want to see it. Do you have any idea why this wasn't run through a processing algorithm? But yet, I told you, it shows up on the image. But but yet it didn't have to be included in processing for the image. You know what might have happened if this would have been included as values of interest?
To have like skewed all the values.
It can kind of skew it. What would happen is, you know, these pixels are high numbers, meaning, you know, decreased brightness. If they would have been included as the values of interest, then the computer, what it would have done is it would have said, oh, we have this area that's, where we have a lot of decreased brightness. So we better lighten up these pixels. We better increase the brightness of these pixels because they're too dark. And so what would happen is the image, it wouldn't rescale properly. In other words, this whole image could end up appearing with increased brightness. In other words, the image would appear too light because if the system thinks, ooh, there are too many high values, this image is going to be dark, we better lighten it up. So you actually end up with a processing error. It would rescale the image too light. So the system knows where it needs to drop its anchor in order to not include that raw radiation, and it knows that by comparing your data set to the model data set, trying to figure out, well, okay, where's your trough in your data set compared to the trough of what we want to see. It knows where to drop those points. So you see how that corresponds?
So it's kind of like when you're taking a picture, like on your phone or something, and you press like your picture on or the thing on your phone, and it's like altering the brightness type of thing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. A lot of what was learned about digital imaging comes from photography. Yep. And then so what happens is when the system determines the values of interest on your histogram, then we end up with automatic rescaling. So it adjusts those brightness levels according to what the user wants to see. So that automatic rescaling. And that is the beauty of digital. It can also be a pitfall, but all of these images, and you've seen these multiple times before, they look alike in terms of the overall brightness because, automatic rescaling, it does maintain relatively consistent brightness regardless of the exposure. So with digital, you can't look at an image most of the time and tell that it's underexposed, or look at it and tell that it's overexposed, unless you're at detector saturation, or if it's extremely modeled. It's very hard to tell whether you're under or overexposed just by looking at it because of the corrections that the system does to the data set. Okay. Those are the corrections it does to the data set. So that's one of the things that will take place is this automatic rescaling. Then the other thing that it does is it will apply the lookup table. We've talked about that. That gives it the contrast. That gives that data set the contrast. So it will alter those pixel values to correspond to the level of contrast that we want to be displayed. So do you see a difference between these two? Same KDP was used, but the processing that was applied to those numbers is a little different, so the contrast has been altered. Okay. So this one looks a little more black and white, this one looks a little grayer, but yet the same KDP was used, it's just how the numbers were manipulated. You okay so far? Okay. So let me talk about these models so you understand what I mean about comparing your histogram to models. There are two types of models, two categories of models. There's something that's called neural, and there's something that's called a priori. Neural histograms rely on the digital system learning exposure patterns and generating model histograms based on the exposure patterns of the individuals who use that equipment. So it's smart, you know, it's like artificial intelligence. It's learning, okay, this is what a histogram should look like for a chest. This is what a histogram should look like for a knee. So the system is learning what your typical exposure patterns are and generating a model histogram, so that when you make an exposure, it's got something to compare it to. The other type of histogram that vendors use is called a priori. So what that means is they already have the histogram models programmed in. You know, there could be 10 histograms, there could be 20, there could be 26, whatever. There are different histogram models already built into the system. So they already exist. They already exist. In our lab, our Fuji system has a priori. So there are, I can't even remember now when we got that software upgrade, how many different histograms there are, you know, for the different exams that you do. And I can't remember how many they put in when they did some upgrades. But anyway, they're pre-programmed histogram models. But
So
generally,
they don't change?
pardon?
They don't change unless you get updates?
Yeah,
Like, they don't change based on
right.
multiple different?
It comes, it's part of the software package. It's part of the software package, those models, yep. But when it comes to a priori histograms, the ones that are already programmed in, even though there could be numerous histograms, we can categorize it basically into three main types, okay? Even though there are variations within these, there are basically three main types of histograms. And yeah, and there are variations between the vendors, but like I said, there are three main types. There's something that's called an extremity model, or type 1. There's a general model, which is referred to as type 2, and then there's something called metal model, which is referred to as type 3. So these are the three basic ones. So the first one, the extremity histogram, this could be what the model histogram looks like in the system. So whenever you do an extremity, this is the basic model that your data set would be compared to. Notice in this model that the values of interest for the histogram start in the trough and go all the way down to the end, okay? Trough and go all the way down to the end, okay? The trough with a type 1 histogram represents the transition from raw radiation to skin line. Because you know, like if you are imaging an elbow, you have a certain amount of raw radiation on each side, right? Because you don't collimate within the skin line, right? You have a skin line showing, and so you have a certain amount of raw radiation. So it drops its anchor right here in the trough, signifying, okay, here's where the data set is transitioning to skin line. So we want to include in our rescaling, in our altering of the numerical values, everything from the skin on down here to here. So if this is skin line, what does this big bump represent? What do we have? So this is like skin line, you've got soft tissue, and then all of a sudden this big bump. Bone. Okay, 'cause remember, as you move towards this end, more absorption, and you've got a lot of bone, you know, with extremity, okay? So extremity 1 will, the extremity model will include data or its values of interest from the skin line, on down, through the bone. So it will include those numbers in the processing algorithm. This big spike here represents raw radiation. Of course, that raw radiation is still going to appear on your image, but it's not going to include this in recomputing numbers or values for those pixels, because there's so much of that it would end up rescaling the image way too light. So that information will still appear, but it's just not used in the processing algorithm. You wonder who came up with all this stuff. Now, the cool thing is with digital, is that you can create different menus to accentuate certain structures, which is kind of nice. You can create menus up front to be classified as a soft tissue menu or a bone menu. So if you know somebody's here for a soft tissue study, you can select the button that says, okay, soft tissue neck. And it will process that information differently than if you just select a regular C-spine. So it's kind of cool that you can do that. So, it's nice because essentially you're using the same technical factors, and a histogram is generated. You're not changing your technical factors, because normally when you would do a soft tissue, when we would do soft tissue neck, we'd have to cut way back on the KVP so that we would get a lot of absorption by the soft tissue. And then if we wanted to accentuate the bone, we'd have to make a second exposure using a higher KVP to see the bone. But now you can do this just by changing the menu, the processing menu. And so what happens is it changes the values of interest. So just to kind of give you an example here. If a system includes these as a value of interest from the skin line only through this big, this hump here, we end up accentuating soft tissue. We're not including the bone in the reprocessing. You see how it just made the bone really light, but it accentuated the soft tissue. It increased the luminance of that soft tissue. Yeah.
So where did you say you can change that menu?
Well, you have to have a super user go in and actually,
Oh.
somebody's got to create a soft tissue menu.
Okay.
I mean, so it would appear on your workstation. You know how you all will select wrist or elbow or abdomen. You would select, soft tissue neck or whatever the case is. So someone that knows how to operate the software and manipulate that, they would have to go in and create that menu for that to be a selection for you. And then with this one here, it accentuates bone. Accentuates bone. So notice how it cut off some of it didn't want to include that much skin in altering values. It just wanted to focus on from here to here. Didn't really want to include the skin. It wanted to focus more on the bone and some of the soft tissue, but it left all that skin off there. Left it all off, so that the bone is accentuated. So that's kind of the cool thing about digital is processing menus can be changed to bring out certain features of structures. But it has to be someone that knows how the system works to go in and create these different menus. I just wanted to show you, examples of what can be done. So that's the extremity model. So the extremity model drops the anchor, we can call it the anchor, drops that anchor point right in the middle of the trough, because that signifies a skin line, and it wants to include that in the processing. This is a type 2 model. With a type 2 histogram model, like for doing abdomens, maybe femurs, chest, when it looks at your data set and compares it to the model, this is what the model looks like. And it is going to drop the value of interest anchor to the left of the skin line. In other words, it's because there may not be a skin line. When you do an abdomen, how likely are you to be able to collimate on an abdomen so that you see a skin line? Maybe on pediatrics, but on most adults, you're not going to see a skin line. Even on a femur, you might not see a skin line. On a chest, you might not, okay? But typically, with abdomens, you're not going to see a skin line. So the system knows that for an abdomen, it's going to look for certain values that signify, okay, this is soft tissue. We only want to include in our processing, once we know we're inside the soft tissue, all the way to the lowest value. So the soft tissue, the bones, and the abdomen. It is not looking for skin line values per se, because there's really not a skin line value. There's really not a skin line value. So it will include these values in its processing. If there happens to be a skin line, fine. But you have to remember too, it's not important to see a skin line. That's why even if there was a skin line, it doesn't make a difference that it's not included in its processing in order to show up properly. But when you're talking about extremities, why is it important to see skin line with extremities? Why does the system want to make sure it properly processes the skin line so it shows up okay? Why do you need to see skin line with extremities?
I mean, there's structures they still wanna see when it comes to like, locating, like comparing where bones are located to the body part, or when they're looking at, displacements of bones, I feel like just helping.
Okay. Could be like in the case of fractures, displacement, and some bones coming through soft tissue. Also too, and maybe you haven't talked about this, yeah, because you haven't done pathophysiology. Soft tissue swelling, a fracture might not show up, it might not really be visible, but if there's soft tissue swelling, that could perhaps be an indication, I think there is a fracture over in this area. So there can be clues within the soft tissue that signify that there is some type of pathology going on. So with extremities, that's why you want to see the skin line. So the system wants to make sure that it includes those skin values so it can properly process them so the skin does show up okay. But with an abdomen, who cares if the skin shows up or not? If there happens to be a skin line, or even with a femur, it doesn't matter. It's not critical like it is with extremities, because the soft tissue can hold clues for extremity pathologies. You'll probably learn more about that next semester. Yeah, next semester. I think you have 2 semesters of it. And then this is the metal model, type 3. And with this, does not need to see a skin line, so notice it drops the anchor to the left of the trough. This would be something like an abdomen with barium in it. Okay, or even prosthetics, doesn't need to include the skin line. You notice this is raw radiation. And then we've got the bone in the abdomen. We'll pretend this is an abdomen with barium in it, so this would be like the bone. And then all of a sudden we have this big increased hump here with very low values. What do you think that corresponds to? All these low values. Remember the way it moves, raw radiation, bone. The abdomen, so the intestines with the barium in it. So those, and the intestines are soft tissue structure, but because there's barium in it, we get this big hump because so much absorption takes place. So it will drop the anchor to the left because we don't care about processing skin line. Drops it to the left, but notice it does not take it all the way down here to the minimum value. because there are a number of pixels that have a value of 0, you know, value of 5, 10, whatever. But it doesn't drop it to those low values. It drops it right here in this trough, because that trough signifies there is a change in absorption in the structure. That change in absorption is due to the barium. So what do you think would happen if the values of interest went all the way down here? How do you think it would process that image? It'd probably be darker than than it should be, because it sees all of these really high luminance values, or low values. Remember, low values give us high luminance. And so the system would think, oh my gosh, this image is going to really be too bright. And so it would end up rescaling it a little too dark.
So there, would it be excludes high luminance areas?
I'm sorry, what?
Would it be excludes high luminance areas?
It excludes it from, it won't exclude it from the image, but it excludes it from the processing algorithm. Because you don't want the processing algorithm to see all of this, these low values, and for the system to think, oh, this image is going to be way too bright, you know, we better jack these numbers up, because it actually most time ends up overcompensating and would make it too dark. And your image is too dark because it thinks your image is going to be too light, so it ends up making it too dark. So, I mean, this will still show up on the image. You'll still see the barium in the intestines. It's just it doesn't include those values in the processing, because you don't want it to rescale improperly.
So does luminance, I'm confused, talk about the brightness or the
Right.
number?
Now, luminance is brightness, and it is relative to the number. You know, we talked about luminance and brightness when we did receptor exposure, and even image data. Remember, so the lower the number, that means it's white. So when you look at a monitor, that's referred to as areas of increased brightness, because if it's white, it's bright. And higher numbers correspond to darker areas, you know, shows up black. When that comes up on the monitor, that's referred to as areas of decreased brightness, because the color's dark.
So should that say low?
We just mean it should
Yeah,
say
so
either
that's the
high
high.
luminance or low value
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
second bullet.
It's confusing.
Oh, with the,
It's
the-
just confusing.
oh, I see, what you- okay, because of how I worded that. Yeah, say, low value areas.
Low value
Yeah, sorry,
areas.
yeah.
Okay.
So say the low value areas. Low value areas. Okay. Low value areas. And then this way it will rescale properly. Same thing with prosthetics. If there's a hip replacement, you would end up with this big bulk of low numbers, because the prosthetic device, the metal, absorbed that radiation. And so you don't want it to rescale too dark. So it would exclude that end. Okay?
Are there options to, like, after the image has been taken, not as a super user, to sort of apply a different menu to it to see if you can?
We'll try tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll play around tomorrow a little bit and see. Sound good?
It's like, can't you, like, after you take the image, like, kind of alter brightness anyway?
Mm-hmm. And we'll do some of that tomorrow, so that you can see what's happening. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So menu selection is extremely important, because when you select a menu, you're doing a knee, you know, a AP knee, you select AP knee. You know, you're doing an abdomen, you select AP abdomen. It's very important that you select the proper menu, because every menu has a histogram tied to it. It has a histogram tied to it. And so you need that type of quality image, you know, proper histogram analysis. Okay, proper histogram analysis. There are also reasons too, not only, I only have ethics up here, but there are also legalities here in terms of menu selection. And we'll talk about that tomorrow, the ethics and the legalities behind proper menu selection. And I'll show you something that's called the DICOM header. I have an example here, but we'll talk about it tomorrow and see it. So you do need to select the proper menu, okay? You do need to select the proper menu to process that image. So here's the knee phantom. I did 75 kDP, 2.5 mass. I did a tabletop, selected the knee menu. Here I selected the hand menu. 75 kDP, 2.5 mass, tabletop, but I used the hand menu. Different histogram that I compared it to. Different histogram, and it changes that appearance. If the scales differently, the lookup table is different, you know, for the contrast, it completely changed the way that image looked, okay? This is something that's called DICOM. We'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow, and we'll talk more about it next fall. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about DICOM and what it is. But, you know, some things that I'll point out to you tomorrow has to do with, well, for example, here. You able to see what this says? L-spine, lateral. Behind the scenes of every image, there is what we call DICOM information. So there's all this textual data, text data that accompanies an image. And lo and behold, somewhere in this string of data, it even says what it is that was imaged. And we'll look, there's some these are all lines of code. We'll look at some specific lines of code tomorrow, okay? But it even has things like the date the image was taken, the acquisition time, so it knows what time you made that exposure, that type of thing, you know, where it was done, once you add side. It even, for the PSP plate, has the identification number for the PSP plate, that type of thing. So there's all sorts of information that's tied to this. It'll also have the patient's information as well. So this is behind the scenes information that accompanies every image. Okay? Like I said, we'll look at it tomorrow, certain aspects of it, but we will talk more about it next fall. Next fall. But it's called DICOM. Okay. All right. You okay up to this point? What time we have?
9.
Oh, 9 o'clock. You want to take 10 minutes, or you want to go through these last slides, and then it's up to you.
Go through the last, it's 6.
I think, what, we have 30 slides,
It's 30.
like 5 more slides?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it.
Okay, all right. So that's the basics, like how that histogram works, you know, comparing your data set to a model. You know, just some processing operations that you need to be familiar with. Processing that is done to images can alter the grayscale, essentially meaning the contrast, okay, but you know, tends to be referred to as grayscale because, you know, bit depth is the grayscale. So they're processing algorithms that can be used to manipulate the grayscale. There are other ones that can be used to manipulate, like, the appearance of spatial resolution. And grayscale, really technically not just contrast, but even the brightness. Brightness and contrast are also linked together as well. So things that can be done to manipulate grayscale, things can be done to manipulate the resolution. So these are referred to as processing operations. Let's see. In terms of grayscale processing, you may hear it referred to as spatial location domain, but what's really important are these other names. So with grayscale processing, these are other names for processing that can end up altering the contrast and the brightness of an image. Okay? So it can be called grayscale mapping, contrast enhancement, it can be called contrast stretching, or histogram modification. The top two tend to be the most common: grayscale mapping and contrast enhancement. So these two types of, or these two words represent processing that can be done to alter the contrast and brightness. So what it does is it takes every input value for pixels, so it takes every pixel input value, and it transforms it into an output value. So it takes every input value and it transforms it into an output value so that it displays the way we want it to display. You know, that's why you can be underexposed. You know, you can be underexposed or you can be overexposed, and those pixel values are adjusted. You know, like if you're overexposed, that means you have a lot of high values. Well, it will lower those values. It will change some of those high values to lower values so that the image isn't too dark. Okay? And so when that happens, it gives you a different appearance for the contrast, it changes the brightness. Yeah,
So this is where, you were saying that we can't add any pixels, but we can change how they appear.
well, right, like if you have a modeled image, but that'll come with spatial resolution.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that one. But right, you can never create, pixel values that aren't, I mean, if you don't have data, you don't have data, right? And so with grayscale processing, it's changing the values of the pixel, because remember, the pixel value depends, of course, ultimately upon the bit depth, but it also depends upon the intensity of the signal that was received. So if you have a really high signal intensity, you've got really high values. You have low signal intensity, maybe you didn't use enough KVP, you didn't have enough penetration, there was too much absorption, all your pixel values are low. Some of those low pixel values need to be changed to higher values so the image appears properly. So grayscale processing, it looks at all those pixel values and the adjustments that it makes to those pixel values is referred to as grayscale processing. So that, you know, when it uses histogram analysis to compare your values to a model histogram, it's going to change your values to get your values to look like what that model histogram has. And we've talked about these examples here, like equalization. Equalization, what has happened here, or is this what you were referring to though, with changing the pixel values with equalization? Are you talking about, well, because you had said creating photons, that would be, well, kind of applies here too.
I thought
But we'll talk about smoothing.
okay, that's what I was about to say. I thought that was smoothing what Whitney was referring to.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Yep. Well, what's happened here is, okay, this chest image was taken, but they really should have ordered an abdomen because they wanted to see a tube. But instead of going up and re-exposing the patient, they were able to reprocess the image using an equalization function. And so what it did is it shifted the pixel values. It altered pixels. See how pixel values, so these pixels were made darker, you know, decreased brightness, so they gave these pixel values higher values. It increased the number of the pixel inside the pixel so that this could be visible. Okay, so it can alter that. But maybe this too is where you were talking about. If we were to zoom in on this area though, it would be modeled. It would be modeled because it was able to shift pixel values or increase pixel values for the pixels that were there, but there was so much absorption here, because you gotta remember, this was for a chest image. So the exposure factors were not appropriate to, you know, to get penetration of the abdomen area.
So
So-
is it essentially reducing the contrast? Or is,
Yeah, it can, depending on how those values shift, it can reduce the contrast, but you can also increase the
it's like
contrast
it's like
too.
you're willing to reduce it because what you're trying to see,
Yeah,
and that it becomes something that you're kind of willing to give up because you'd rather see that part than
That
they wanna
part.
see, okay.
yeah. It's just shifting those values, and you see how it's changed the brightness, and it did change the contrast. And this was after the fact, at the push of a button. But if you know this is gonna be a situation up front, there could be some places that have that menu already built in, you know, so that when you initially select the menu for this chest, that's, you know, how it would appear. That's how it would appear. But, yeah. So that just, what it did is it just shifted the values on that histogram. Here's lookup table. This is our Fuji system. You don't need to know O curve and M curve. They have all these different lookup tables, but here I wanted to show you here how contrast and brightness has changed. Because technically, if you change the lookup table, even though the lookup table impacts contrast, it does also end up having an impact on the brightness. I mean, look what I did with this image here, completely flipped it. So those values completely changed. The high values became low, the low values became high. And you see how that not only impacted the contrast, but it does impact the brightness of the image. We have more, you know, this is increased brightness now compared to what we have here, but then the bone is decreased brightness compared to what we have here. So it just completely, you know, flipped it, completely flipped it.
So lookup table flips the brightness side?
Well, lookup table is associated with contrast. It alters the contrast, but contrast and brightness are tied together. So if you want to alter the contrast like you did here, it does drag brightness along with it. You know, it's going to have an impact on the brightness as well.
So it flips the contrast
It,
values?
well, in this case it did. I completely flipped them here. So all the low values became high, the high values became
So
low.
the flipping is just one option under lookup.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a total flipping like this, it could be a, you know, gradual
Okay.
change. Yeah, I just want to show you an extreme, yeah. And actually to the computer, and I told you all this when we did image data, this is what the elbow looks like to the computer. But remember I told you medical imaging, our values have to be flipped. So in other words, zeros have to be white, the higher numbers have to be black, because if not, this is how computer sees the image, and that's how it would display it, but we don't look at medical images like that. So in the system for us, the zeros become white and the higher numbers become black, which is the opposite of how the computer sees the data. So if you happen to look up histograms and you look at photography, or you know, you look at computers, you're going to see the values on the histograms presented differently than how I've given them to you, because they do it as the computer looking at it.
Makes me think of when you would get, like when you get a disposable camera developed and they put the little like film in there and it looks, you know, flipped.
The negatives.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
That's
Yep.
what it is.
It is. And then the last little section is resolution processing. It's referred to as spatial frequency domain, but anyway, this is the goal. The goal of resolution processing is either to enhance what the image looks like enhance the sharpness, or suppress the noise. So they're either trying to enhance the sharpness or suppress the noise. So let's look at noise reduction first. So suppress noise reduction. We've already mentioned this low pass filtering. What it does is suppresses the high frequencies. I don't care that you know specifically what is happening here in terms of this information, but do know that low pass filtering is synonymous with smoothing. Okay, so low pass filtering is synonymous with smoothing. What it does is it essentially kind of blurs the pixels together, because you could have an image that is modeled, so you're missing data points, and that looks terrible. So it will kind of blend the pixels together to kind of fill in the gaps. But if you're missing data points, you're missing data points. So it really doesn't do anything. It takes away the modeled look, but it doesn't do anything to the spatial resolution. I mean, you should have good spatial resolution if you set everything properly. You know, no motion, your geometric factors were fine. So this actually kind of reduces that spatial resolution, to be honest with you, because it's blurring pixels together. So it really does not help spatial resolution at all. It really just reduces the appearance of the model.
So, it's not blurring what we see, it's just blurring I think I'm confused myself.
So here's the model, all those dots, and then it kind of
Okay,
blurs that data together, so it actually,
just,
it really doesn't look as sharp
okay.
here as it does here, because it's actually blurred it a little bit.
I feel like a good example is, like obviously with X-ray, you want to see all the detail because you want to like pick apart all the little things that are happening, but when you talk about like celebrities or magazines that will, you know, Photoshop images, like you don't wanna see pores, so they'll like smooth the skin to make it like,
Yep.
all that stuff disappear.
Yep, that's what they're doing.
And it's like, they look too perfect.
Yes, exactly, too
They
perfect.
don't have any pores.
Right, exactly. So I mean, this looks better in terms of model, but it doesn't do anything, you know, it actually makes spatial resolution, it actually does degrade it because it's blurring the stuff together. The whole thing, that was a selling point for vendors to say, look, you can use a really low exposure, spare the patient from exposure, and then all you gotta do is apply the smoothing algorithm to get rid of the model. Okay, well, that's great, but look what you really kind of degraded the spatial resolution that I did have. So, it was a selling feature. And then, in terms of something that is used to enhance image sharpness, it's called high-pass filtering or edge enhancement. And we've already, you know, talked about this as well. Edge enhancement. What edge enhancement does is it actually changes the contrast between structural borders so that you see better resolution. It changes the contrast between borders to make those structures more visible. The downside is if you over apply it, you get a halo effect. That's just way too much contrast there between the black and the white, and unfortunately that could end up mimicking pathology. Could make it look like the bone is necrosing. So you have to be careful with some of these things. But this can be used to enhance spatial resolution. You know, if the radiologist or orthopedic surgeon really wants to see the screws and what those threads look like, or you know, the heads of the screws. But if you over apply it, then it makes it look like pathology. But this is used to enhance spatial resolution by changing the contrast between structural borders. But edge enhancement is considered to be a spatial resolution. Because remember, spatial resolution and contrast are tied too. Contrast is tied to brightness, contrast is tied to spatial resolution. Okay. So you're right with that, you think? Digest it? Okay. So Friday, the quiz, I'll post the fluoro stuff sometime tomorrow. So for the rest of